Choosing a zoom lens in 2026 is harder than ever because the old rules are breaking. Canon now has a 24 to 105 mm f2.8 that challenges the classic 24 to 70. Sony has a 50 to 150 mm f2 that feels like a portrait prime kit in one lens, and Sigma is pushing full-frame zooms into f1.8 territory. So the real question is no longer just which zoom is convenient. It is which zoom can actually replace the lenses photographers once thought were untouchable. If that question matters to you, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses, because this is exactly what we are here for. At number 10, we have the Canon RF 200 to 800 mm f6.3 to 9 IS USM. And what it represents is not just reach, it is access. For most of photography's history, 800 mm belong to a very specific kind of photographer. The kind with a professional budget, a large bag, and a very clear reason to be at the edge of a wildlife reserve at sunrise. 800 mm of reach meant you were either working for a major publication, or you had made a serious financial commitment to the craft. For everyone else, that kind of distance stayed aspirational. Canon built this lens for the birding community, for aviation photographers, for wildlife enthusiasts who are serious about their craft but not chasing a professional Super-Telephoto price tag. The zoom range alone tells you what kind of shooting this lens was designed for. 200 mm gives you a useful starting point for larger animals in open terrain. 800 mm puts you at a distance that used to require glass that cost as much as a used car. The IS system does real work here. Handheld shooting at the long end of this range is genuinely possible, which matters enormously when you are tracking a bird in flight or following movement through unpredictable terrain. The autofocus, running on Canon's RF mount, keeps pace with fast subjects in a way that older telephoto zooms simply could not manage. And the size, while not small, is meaningfully more portable than the professional primes it sits beneath in Canon's lineup. But here is the honest part. This is not an L-series lens. The aperture at the long end is slow. f9 at 800 mm means you are working in good light, or you are pushing your sensor harder than you might like. Indoor sports, low-light wildlife, dusk shooting, those are not where this lens lives. It is a lens for distance. And in wildlife photography, distance is often the variable that makes or breaks the frame. That one thing, done well, is enough to earn it a place on this list. At number 9, we have the Nikon Z 24 to 120 mm f4S, and the case for it is almost frustratingly simple. Not every lens earns its place by being dramatic. Some earn it by being dependably, consistently, quietly excellent, the kind of lens you reach for without thinking because it has never let you down. That is a different kind of value, and it is easy to underestimate until you have spent a full day shooting and realize the lens never came off the camera. 24 to 120 mm at a constant f4, built to S-line standards, in a package that balances beautifully on Nikon Z series bodies. It is not trying to win any argument about aperture speed or focal length extremes. It is trying to be the one lens a photographer trusts enough to leave mounted all day, whether they are covering a documentary, shooting a landscape, working a social event, or traveling without wanting to carry a full kit. The range is the real story. A 24 to 70 mm gives you flexibility. But the moment you need a little more reach, a candid across the room, a portrait with compression, a tighter environmental shot, you are either swapping glass or cropping. The 24 to 120 mm removes that moment of hesitation. It just reaches a little further, and that extra range compounds across a full day of shooting in ways that are hard to quantify but immediately felt. The compromise is real, though. If you are shooting events in low light, f4 is going to push your ISO higher than f2.8 would. Subject separation at f4 is pleasant but not dramatic. This is not the lens for photographers chasing razor-thin focus planes or indoor receptions with minimal lighting. But for the photographer who wants one high-quality tool that simply works across a wide range of situations, this lens proves that sometimes the most important glass in your bag is not the most exciting one. It is the one you trust. At number 8, we have the Sony FE 24 to 70mm f2.8 G Master 2. And its place on this list is not about being the newest or most unusual zoom available. It is about being the benchmark. Every category has a standard, a reference point that other lenses are quietly compared against, whether or not anyone says it out loud. In the professional standard zoom category, the 24 to 70mm f2.8 has held that position for years. And within that category, Sony's G Master version has been one of the clearest expressions of what that lens type can be when it is built without compromise. Wedding photographers, event shooters, documentary filmmakers, portrait photographers working controlled environments, this is the focal range that covers most of what professional work demands. 24mm for context and environment, 50mm for natural perspective, 70mm for portraits with gentle compression, the f2.8 aperture for low-light confidence and subject separation that clients can see. What the second generation brought to this formula was refinement that actually matters in the field. The lens got lighter, which sounds minor until you have carried a heavy zoom through a 12-hour wedding. The autofocus got faster and more precise, which matters enormously on hybrid sets, where the camera is switching between stills and video. The optical performance stayed at the level professionals expect from G Master glass. This is a lens that works the way professionals need tools to work reliably, quickly, and without asking for patience in exchange for performance. Honest assessment, this lens is no longer the most thrilling entry in the zoom market. There are lenses on this list that make bolder arguments and push harder at what zoom glass can do. But the 24 to 70mm f2.8 remains one of the safest, most complete professional investments in the Sony ecosystem, and safe when you are working a job that cannot be reshot is exactly what you need. At number 7, we have the Tamron 35 to 150mm f2 to 2.8 III VXD, and it was built specifically for a problem every wedding photographer knows. You are in the middle of a ceremony. Something is happening, a look, a laugh, a hand being held, and your 24 to 70mm is not quite reaching where you need it to be. You could swap to the 70 to 200mm, but by the time the lens is off the body and the other one is on, the moment is already in the past. You shot the transition, not the moment. The focal range is unconventional by design. It starts at 35mm, wide enough for environmental portraits and full group frames, and reaches all the way to 150mm, giving you the compression and reach that used to require a second body or a fast lens swap. That range in a single barrel is the entire argument for this lens. The aperture range makes it more interesting still. At the wide end, you are at f2, fast enough for indoor ceremonies with dim lighting, fast enough for subject separation that feels prime-like, fast enough to make the background disappear behind a bride's expression. As you zoom longer, it steps to f2.8, which is still the professional standard for low-light event work. This is a lens that covers two of the most important zoom ranges in event photography without requiring a bag change. The compromises are worth knowing. 35mm as your widest angle is a real limitation if you are working in tight spaces. Small chapels, narrow reception venues, cramped indoor environments where 24mm suddenly becomes essential. The lens is also not light. Carrying it through a long day is a commitment. But for photographers who spend their working lives moving between wide group shots and compressed portrait moments, this lens asks a very reasonable question. What if you never had to choose? At number 6, we have the Sigma 28 to 105mm f2.8 DG DNArt, and its argument is simple and effective. If there is one thing the Art series has consistently done, it is take the expected boundaries of a lens S category and push them until something more useful comes out the other side. Sigma does not make incremental lenses. They make opinionated ones. Lenses that have a clear point of view about what photographers actually need, even when that point of view challenges what the major brands have decided the category should look like. A constant f2.8 aperture across a zoom range that extends to 105mm gives Sony E mount and L mount photographers something that was previously unavailable without stepping into Canon's significantly larger and more expensive RF 24 to 105mm f2.8. If you need f2.8 speed and you need more reach than a 24 to 70mm provides, this lens exists specifically to solve that equation. The 105mm end is more useful than it might initially appear. For portrait photographers, 105mm at f2.8 produces compression and background separation that feels serious, not prime serious, but genuinely pleasing in a way that clients respond to. For event shooters working larger rooms, the extra reach means you are moving less and capturing more. For travel photographers who want one lens that covers environmental portraits through to tighter detail shots, the range earns its keep across a full day. The honest limitation is the starting focal length. 28mm instead of 24mm is a meaningful difference for interior architecture, landscape work, and any environment where you genuinely need that wider view. If your work regularly demands 24mm, this lens will frustrate you at the wide end. But if you're shooting lives between portraits, events, and people-focused documentary work, 28 to 105mm at f2.8 is a very compelling range. Sigma made a practical lens here, not a dramatic one, but a useful one. If you are finding this breakdown useful, not just a list of sharp lenses, but a real look at what these zooms actually do for photographers in the field, subscribe to Alt Buzz Lenses. This is what we do here. Lens guides built around real workflow, real hype, and the glass that is actually shaping the market in 2026. Hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next 5 lenses are where things get genuinely interesting. At number 5, we have the Sigma 28 to 45mm f1.8 DGDN Art. And the single most important thing about this lens is the number after the F. Not f2.8, not f2, f1.8. Constant. Across the full zoom range, on full frame mirrorless, this is where the list changes tone. Everything below number 5 has been about useful, practical, professionally relevant glass. Lenses that solve real problems in real workflows. But starting here, we are talking about something different. We are talking about lenses that do not just improve the zoom category, they challenge the entire conversation about what a zoom is allowed to be. That is not a small thing. That is Sigma walking into a room where primes have always the speed advantage and placing a zoom on the table. The practical implications of f1.8 on full frame are significant. The depth of field at that aperture produces subject separation that looks, in many situations, closer to a prime than a zoom. The low light performance opens up shooting environments that f2.8 zooms genuinely cannot handle without pushing ISO into territory that affects image quality. For portrait photographers, for documentary shooters working available light, for video creators who need a fast lens that can still zoom, this aperture number is not a marketing footnote. It is the reason the lens exists. The range is where the compromise lives. 28 to 45mm is not a wide zoom range. It will not replace your standard zoom or your telephoto. What it does is give you a cluster of the most cinematically useful focal lengths, 28mm, 35mm, and 45mm, sitting close to the classic 50mm, all within a single barrel, all at f1.8. This lens is not trying to do everything. It is trying to do one specific thing with a level of aperture speed that zooms were not supposed to be able to offer. And in that very specific role, it does it with authority. At number 4, we have the Nikon Z 70 to 200mm f2.8 VRS2, and what it represents is the next chapter of one of the most foundational lens types in professional photography. There are lenses that reshape categories, and there are lenses that perfect them. The 70 to 200mm f2.8 has been one of the most important professional zoom types in photography for decades. Sports photographers, wedding photographers, portrait photographers working outdoors, press photographers at events, the 70 to 200mm f2.8 has been present at more significant moments than almost any other zoom ever made. It is not a glamorous category anymore, but it is a foundational one. Nikon has rebuilt the 70 to 200 mm for the mirrorless era with a focus on handling, autofocus performance, and hybrid usability that the original Z version did not fully deliver. This is a lens designed for photographers who work assignments, wedding photographers who need reliable telephoto reach from the back of a ceremony, portrait shooters who work outdoors and need compression, sports photographers in controlled environments, press teams who cannot afford to miss a moment because the autofocus hesitated. The performance envelope of this lens is exactly where a professional telephoto zoom should be. The VR system is genuinely effective for handheld work at longer focal lengths. The autofocus tracks with the confidence that Nikon Z system has built its reputation around. The optical quality at 70 to 200 mm f2.8 sits where working photographers need it. Sharp, consistent, and reliable in the conditions that actually occur on professional jobs, not just in controlled tests. The honest reality is that this category is expensive, and the newer S2 version does not come at a budget price. It is also not a lightweight lens. For casual or hobbyist photographers, the investment does not make practical sense. But for working photographers who build their business around the 70 to 200 mm focal range, and there are a great many of them, this updated version is not just a refresh. It is the lens they have been waiting for since they moved to the Z mount. At number 3, we have the Nikon Z24 to 70 mm f2.8 S2, and Nikon's approach here was not to make a dramatically different lens. It was to make a better version of one of the most important professional tools in the system. The 24 to 70 mm f2.8 is photography's most argued over zoom. Some photographers consider it the only lens they truly need on a professional body. Others have moved past it to wider ranges, faster apertures, or more unusual focal lengths. But it keeps coming back because the jobs keep demanding it. Weddings, portraits, events, editorial work, commercial photography. The 24 to 70 mm f2.8 keeps showing up because the work keeps requiring it. The second generation brings a lighter body, which translates to better balance on hybrid rigs and less fatigue across long shooting days. The internal zoom mechanism keeps the barrel length consistent regardless of focal length, which matters on stabilized gimbals and video setups. The autofocus refinements reflect how much hybrid shooting has changed the demands placed on standard zooms. What Nikon understood in building this lens is that the 24 to 70 mm f2.8 does not need to be reimagined, it needs to be upgraded. Photographers who work this focal range professionally know exactly what they need from it. They need it sharp. They need the autofocus fast and accurate. They need it to work seamlessly between stills and video. They need it to feel right on the camera at the end of a long day. The S2 addresses all of those things with the precision you expect from a flagship professional zoom. The category itself is no longer shocking. There are more creative arguments happening at other focal lengths right now, and the 24 to 70 mm f2.8 is a settled idea in a market that increasingly rewards boundary pushing. But settled does not mean irrelevant. In professional photography, the most important lens is often not the most interesting one. It is the one that performs when the job requires it to. This lens performs. At number 2, we have the Canon RF 24 to 105 mm f2.8 IS USM Z. And what Canon did here is refuse to accept a trade-off that photographers had lived with for years. You could have f2.8 brightness in a 24 to 70 mm. Or you could have 105 mm reach in a 24 to 105 mm f4. But not both. The physics of optical design made that combination seem impossible, or at least impractical, at a level that professionals could actually use. So photographers chose. They carried two lenses, or they accepted one compromise, or they changed glass mid-job and hoped the moment would still be there when the lens locked into place. This lens delivers a constant f2.8 aperture across the full 24 to 105 mm range. That is the entire argument. At 24 mm, f2.8. At 70 mm, f2.8. At 105 mm, f2.8. The reach of a 24 to 105 mm and the speed of a 24 to 70 millimeter in a single L-series barrel. For hybrid professionals, for wedding photographers, for documentary shooters, and event creators who have spent years choosing between range and brightness. This lens is the answer to a question the industry spent a long time pretending was unanswerable. The hybrid credentials go further than the focal range. Canon built this lens with video shooters specifically in mind. The IS system works in coordination with IBIS on compatible Canon bodies, delivering the kind of smooth, stable footage that hybrid creators need when shooting handheld. The focus breathing is controlled. The zoom action is designed for smooth operation during video. This is not a stills lens with video as an afterthought. It is a lens built for the way professional content creation actually works in 2020-26. The compromise is real. This is a large lens. It is an expensive lens. It requires a commitment to the Canon RF ecosystem. Casual photographers, lighter kits, and shooters who rarely need the 24 to 105 millimeter range will find the size difficult to justify. But for the hybrid professional who has been carrying two lenses to cover what this single barrel now handles, this is the lens that changes the day-to-day reality of how they work. Canon did not just build a better zoom. They eliminated a compromise that photographers had accepted. For so long, it almost felt permanent. At number 1, we have the Sony FE 50 to 150 mm f2G Master. And what Sony has done here is genuinely audacious. Portrait photographers have their prime kits for a reason. The 50 mm for natural perspective and full-length work. The 85 mm for head and shoulder frames with that first layer of compression. The 105 mm for tight portraits where the background disappears. The 135 mm for the kind of compression and subject isolation that makes a portrait feel cinematic. These are not just focal lengths, they are a language. A vocabulary that portrait photographers spend years learning to speak fluently. And for most of that history, the only way to speak it was to carry every lens separately. This lens covers 50 to 150 millimeters at a constant f2. Think about what that means in practice. Every portrait focal length a working photographer relies on, every compression value from natural to cinematic, all of it accessible from a single zoom ring at f2 in 1G master barrel. This is not Sony improving a zoom lens. This is Sony challenging the fundamental workflow of portrait photography. The f2 aperture at the 150 millimeter end produces subject isolation that is not easy to describe without seeing it. At that focal length, at that aperture, the background does not just blur, it dissolves. The subject emerges from the frame with a three-dimensional quality that used to require a dedicated 135 millimeter prime and a specific distance from the subject to achieve. Wedding photographers working receptions, portrait photographers in the studio, event shooters who need compressed frames with clean backgrounds. This lens performs at a level that makes the prime kit conversation genuinely complicated. The G-Master optical quality means that performance is not just about aperture. The sharpness, the rendering of out-of-focus areas, the autofocus speed and subject tracking accuracy, all of it reflects Sony's flagship lens standards. This is not a lens that offers f2 with asterisks. It is f2 at G-Master quality, which is the standard that working professionals on the Sony system trust. And it is large. It is expensive. It is a professional tool that demands a professional commitment. But for the portrait photographer who has been carrying a bag full of primes and wondering if there was a better way, the answer is Sony just gave them. If this kind of breakdown is what you have been looking for, subscribe to AltBuzz Lenses. We cover the lenses that shape photography, not just the newest products on the release calendar. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments which lens on this list surprised you most. Zoom lenses used to mean compromise. Now the best ones are removing it entirely. Some are replacing prime kits. Some are rebuilding professional workflows from the ground up. The question is no longer whether a zoom can match a prime. In 2026, the better question is how many primes one great zoom can actually replace. The glass is changing. AltBuzz Lenses will be here when it does.